The document that was presented cannot be considered a full-fledged action plan, as much of it depends on the decisions of Western partners. The invitation to join NATO, the deployment of additional troops in Ukraine, and the strengthening of Ukrainian air defense, in particular to shoot down Russian aircraft and missiles, depend on the participation of NATO members. What is not happening now is that our allies and partners are extremely, extremely cautious about all these positions. Unfortunately, despite the widespread message on social media that this is not a plan, but a list of wishes, this is a classic message. I still disagree with this, because it is indeed a comprehensive approach, and even more.
Це класичний меседж. Я все-таки з таким не погоджуюся, тому що дійсно це комплексний підхід.
This victory plan is balanced from the point of view that it can be equally divided into a certain watershed. The first 2.5 points and the next 2.5 points. The first 2.5 points are still what is needed right now to strengthen Ukraine's position, and the next 2.5 points are also an element of deterrence against the Russian Federation. Obviously, it should be not only about Ukraine and its security, but also about the security of the Western world. For example, I can give you an analogy. Just as a base was opened in Romania in 2016, a system is now being deployed in Poland. Ukraine could become part of such a large project. Again, the topic of joint protection and use of Ukrainian resources also demonstrates that Ukraine can be economically interesting for our partners. This is actually an analogy to how American business operates in Israel, for example. For the United States, protecting Israel is not only about protecting its partners, but also about protecting its own economic interests. The third point concerns the possibility of sending Ukrainian military personnel to replace 70,000 Americans in Europe. This is also a very interesting aspect that may actually encourage our partners to implement the first points of the plan. We know that this topic is being discussed quite actively in America, especially by one of the presidential candidates, who says that we need to reduce our presence in Europe within NATO. Nevertheless, this is an interesting topic that can be implemented in the future. This is a concrete action plan, and it is clear that it focuses on our partners. But again, Ukraine's defense forces are doing everything possible to reach out to them today. Perhaps the name of the plan is a bit misleading, because people were expecting a certain roadmap on how we can get to victory. However, Ukraine is doing the best it can, exhausting its resources, efforts, and the lives of many of our defenders. In this situation, of course, as the president said in his speech to the Verkhovna Rada,
тут максимум 100% і 100 навіть більше, витискаючи свої ресурси, свої зусилля, власне, і свої життя багатьох наших захисників. Але в цій ситуації, звичайно, як президент сказав під час виступу у Верховній Раді,
without the support of our partners, we will not be able to win this victory objectively, which is why we rely on them. Now, if we talk about the reaction of the Western world, they're trying to present it in such a way that everyone is as negative as possible and that this plan is rejected. But no, the plan is under discussion. First, the tactic of underestimating feedback is being used here. It means that they will not immediately implement it because this is done in order to analyze it. Then, perhaps, some parts will still be rejected. But the basis will be taken for further implementation and presented as a significant success for both partners and Ukraine. Plus, it is clear that this plan should not affect the election campaign in the United States.
І партнерів, і України, Ну і плюс зрозуміло, що цей план не має впливати на виборчу кампанію в Сполучених Штатах, тому і будь-яка ініціатива в руслі України.
That is why any initiative of Ukraine is now actually muted in the media, and there are certain electoral reasons why this should be done.
Електоральні причини, чому так треба робити. Ну, але тим не менш
Nevertheless, it is very good that today our partners do not reject this plan. It has already been announced that the Ramstein meeting at the level of leaders will take place in November, and it is obvious that this topic will also be raised. I think that, most likely, some of what the president has published will be implemented. But the most important thing is that the invitation to NATO still remains an open question. We understand that this requires specific political will and a change in the position of one particular person, the current president, Joe Biden. Obviously, everyone who advocates for Ukraine's interests will have to work very hard on this, or we take the path of a few months before the end of the current White House's term.
Місяців до завершення каденції нинішнього очільника Білого дому.
Today, President Zelensky was to present Ukraine's victory plan at the European Council summit, as Charles Michel announced on October 15th. The speech is scheduled for October 17th, but the format, remote or in person, remains unknown. This event was previously announced, though not scheduled.
Повідомляв Шарль Мішель, якраз глава цього органу європейського. І от 17 жовтня має відбутися сьогодні виступ президента Зеленського. В якому форматі цей виступ буде чи дистанційно?
Regarding the American reaction to this plan, you mentioned that there are points that are in line or echo the statements of some American presidential candidates. Here, we will not wrap anything in paper. We are talking about the position of Donald Trump, who believes that Americans should not fight in Europe, and that America should not maintain a large military contingent there.
Кандидатів президенти, тут ми не будемо в папірчики нічого загортати, йдемо про позицію Дональда Трампа, який вважає, що...
On the contrary, he proposes to reduce spending on such defense programs on the European continent. For example, in one of the points concerning the post-war situation, the fifth point of the Ukrainian president's victory plan mentions that Ukraine can take over this defense function in Europe.
Більше навіть про післявоєнну ситуацію, про п'ятий пункт, який міститься у цьому плані перемоги українського президента, якраз згадується про те, що Україна може взяти на себе цю функцію.
Consequently, the United States and other European countries will not have to spend as much on defense, security, and the military.
Так багато витрачати на оборону, на безпеку, на мілітарну сферу.
Or does this mean that this point in the Ukrainian victory plan was deliberately written and appeared in this document to appeal to another camp of American politics, the Trumpists? To the Republicans, to those with more isolationist positions before the presidential election. Perhaps this was done so that each candidate would pay attention to this document. Of course, one of the reasons for this clause is what you mentioned, but not the only one. Still, Kyiv feels its own responsibility in terms of complicity in the organization of collective security in Europe. There is a reason why we are joining NATO. It is not only a desire to receive security guarantees for ourselves, but also a desire to ensure security in Europe as a whole. Ukraine, which has the greatest experience in fighting the biggest threat to Europe today, namely Russia, has invaluable experience.
Проти найбільшої загрози сьогодні для Європи, проти російського агресора.
We also understand that after the end of active hostilities, after the end of a large-scale war, a huge demobilization process will begin. Some will return to civilian life, but others will want to continue their service on a contract basis.
Хтось піде у цивільне життя, але хтось захоче продовжувати службу на контракті. І якраз направлення наших військовослужбовців на заміщення 70 тисяч
Sending our servicemen to replace 70,000 American troops is an opportunity to continue military service and receive a decent salary in accordance with NATO standards. This is a pretty good option. We can draw an analogy with the way Ukraine used to actively participate in various peacekeeping operations, and our military personnel proved to be the best. In this situation, by the way, I would like to point out that even the fifth paragraph on security overlaps with the fifth article of the Washington Treaty on Collective Security. This can be used in the future for information purposes. But nevertheless, it is also really an appeal to Trumpists to show that Ukraine is an important issue for the United States today in the further implementation of Washington's plans.
Все ж таки реалізації планів Вашингтона, хто б не переміг на виборах президента, Україна
No matter who wins the presidential election, Ukraine will, firstly, cooperate with everyone, and secondly, it is not a country that should be abandoned and put on the back burner. Currently, there is a message that Trump will allegedly trade Israel for Ukraine and give Ukraine to Russia's zone of influence. This should never be allowed to happen.
Цього допускати в жодному разі не можна. Навпаки, Україна – це держава, яка з залізобетону є частиною західного світу.
On the contrary, Ukraine is a country that is firmly part of the Western world, and we can contribute to the development of security, economy, and the future life of this part of our planet. This is definitely true. The fourth point is where we kind of move from the end to the beginning in our conversation. The fourth point is about the strategic economic potential of Ukraine and the resources that are controlled by Ukraine and that are concentrated on our territory. We are talking about important metals, in particular uranium, which is needed by France, in particular in its nuclear industry, for nuclear power plants and other programs. This also applies to titanium, graphite, lithium, which is now used in the electric car industry. These are indeed very valuable resources. Ukraine ranks sixth in the world in terms of uranium deposits. All this information is, in principle, publicly available. So why emphasize it in terms of winning? Do Western partners really not know what resources Ukraine has? The proposal to sign agreements with the EU and the US on joint protection, investment, extraction, and use of these resources has a pragmatic basis and is not just about protecting EU ideals and values and standing up to Russian autocracy.
Інвестування, видобуток, використання цих ресурсів, скажімо так, чим вона мотивована, ця позиція, ця пропозиція, зрозуміло, що тут йде мова про...
But it is also about a mutually beneficial process of cooperation that our Western partners can take advantage of. If they support Ukraine, they will have access to our resources. This is essentially trade. Defense interests and resources actually go hand in hand. But will this proposal work at a time when all these fields can be shelled by Russian missiles?
То, власне, отримують доступ до наших ресурсів. Це зрозуміло. Це торгівля, по суті, певною мірою, так, оборонні інтереси і...
Any investment is under the threat of pressure from the Russian military machine. To what extent is this point justified in terms of victory? The signing of the agreement to ensure the security of these facilities is aimed at ensuring that Ukraine's economic potential is not destroyed. This is necessary to get an additional security umbrella for strategic facilities, deposits, and minerals. This makes sense because, strange as it may seem, the Russian Federation actually destroys the potential of a competitor during a large-scale war. Yes, everyone will say that Russia is the largest country in terms of mineral deposits. It has the largest amount of land, but this did not prevent it from absolutely illegally adding 6 Ukrainian regions to its constitution. This shows that, if they have the opportunity, they continue to absorb territories where a significant amount of minerals is concentrated. Therefore, all of this needs to be discussed, and publicly, to prevent Russian propaganda from playing on this topic. We remember how they used to play on the topic of the gas transportation system in Ukrainian politics, how they used to play on the topic of opening the land market. There may be similar influences on public opinion here, but again, this is definitely not the African version, where diamond and gold deposits are taken away from the population and production is carried out exclusively for the interests of Western powers.
На цій темі, ми пам'ятаємо до того, як активно грали на темі і ГТС в політиці України, як грали на темі відкриття ринку землі. Тут можуть бути схожі інструменти для...
We are talking about real joint production and mining.
Знову ж таки підкреслюю, що це точно не африканський варіант, де у жителів там забирають там корисні...
We have forms of investment activity. Let me remind you that we always have representatives from the Congress who come to us to indicate the interest of the United States.
У нас є такі якраз форми діяльності і щодо інвестування. Плюс я нагадаю, що до нас завжди там з Конгресу, наприклад, приїжджає до той же Лінсі Грем, який дійсно прямо там вказував інтерес для Сполучених Штатів.
Joint ventures could indeed be established, and various estimates of interesting deposits were mentioned. This shows that Ukraine can interest not only Western countries, but also all countries that are our partners in the world with such joint actions.
Все ж таки зацікавити, до речі, не лише західні країни, але і всі країни, які є нашими партнерами по світу, які нам допомагають. Тобто ми показуємо, що ми ці ресурси, все ж таки цими ресурсами посилимо...
We are demonstrating that these resources will strengthen global democracy and the market economy. And of course, we will continue to earn from these resources. And with the admission of those countries that, in the most difficult and challenging time for us, provided the assistance that was necessary for Ukraine's survival. Of course, we are ready to return the favor. The question here is very simple. Either we will develop all these resources that Ukraine now possesses with civilized Western partners, or these territories and deposits will be under Russian influence or control, or will be destroyed by Russia or depleted. We have seen how the Soviet Union depleted Ukraine for many decades to develop its aggressive military complex, threatening the whole world. Putin is trying to reproduce this model. Let's be realistic. In fact, he has started this war for resources, human, territorial, Ukrainian subsoil, and so on. Without Ukraine, Russia cannot be a geopolitical power and a serious force in the global market. The pragmatic part of the victory plan is quite logical and has its own reasons and origins. Regarding President Zelensky's assumption or his vision of how this plan should work, I have one more question for you, Ihor. When presenting the plan to our parliamentarians and abroad, the president said that if the plan is implemented, the war could be over by the end of 2025. Where does such optimism and calculations come from?
Тобто, якщо він буде працювати, то війну можна закінчити до кінця 2025 року.
Perhaps there is some formula that brings us to this date. Currently, even the first point of Ukraine's invitation to NATO looks like a multi-year program. From the moment of invitation to the implementation of all processes in the parliaments of NATO countries, several years may pass. Indeed, where did this date of the end of 2025 come from, and was it necessary to announce it? Obviously, this date refers to the situation in the Russian economy and the criticality of finding additional sources of pressure on Ukraine. We have already seen this theme with North Korea in terms of engaging their military personnel, as well as further search for volunteers from around the world.
джерел тиску безпосередньо на Україну, бо ми ж бачимо і ця тема із Північною Кореєю щодо залучення їхніх військовослужбовців.
If Saudi Arabia starts implementing plans to increase the volume of its oil on the world market, this will seriously undermine the overall global price of Brent crude. Let me remind you that the price of Ural is 89% of Brent, so Russians will receive significantly less money.
Обсягів нафти, своєї нафти на світовому ринку, то, звичайно, це дуже серйозно підкосить загальну світову ціну на нафту марки Brent, а марка Urals російська.
Accordingly, the resources for continuing the war will be leveled. In addition, the steps outlined in the victory plan include transferring the war to the aggressor's territory, attacking its military capabilities, economic pressure, and forcing Russia to peace.
Ну і плюс ті кроки, які прописані в плані перемоги, це перенесення війни, подальше перенесення війни на територію країни-агресора, подальші атаки по його військовій спроможності.
All of this should work in a consolidated manner and ultimately lead Putin to the idea of ending this war.
Консолідовано і все ж таки привести Путіна до думки щодо необхідності завершення цієї війни.
Recent social surveys by the Levada Center have shown that a relative majority of Russians say that this war is bringing more negatives than positives. This situation can be interpreted in the context of Russian propaganda, where they claim that they do not want to fight, but it is a necessity for them. However, war fatigue is felt not only among Ukrainians and Western partners, but also in Russian society. This fatigue is also growing among people who are involved in this process, including families who receive black packages, as well as those who certain consequences of the actions of veterans of the so-called military operations, their aggression, etc. In other words, in many regions today, there are people who really believe that this war needs to end. However, the corresponding incentive directly on the territory of the Russian Federation needs to be strengthened so that more and more Russians realize the disastrousness of this process started by their tyrant.